The fact that I took the cyborg motif had nothing to do with the cyberpunk boom that was prevailing at the time. In fact, while drawing sci-fi manga, I came to the realization that cyborgs are particularly well suited to describing the inner life of people. The cyborgs, Zalem, and also the junkyard are metaphors for contemporary society, but I didn't put them down on paper to criticize anything concretely. The junkyard is a world devoid of values. No tradition, no mythology, no ideology. We already live in such a world. The important thing now is not to complain about whether this is good or bad, but to recognize that this is so. In the contrast between one's own inner ignorance and the harsh external reality, it is important to be aware of it and live your life without becoming cynical. It's not about feelings, it's about willpower. Here lies the true meaning of the struggle to preserve one's individuality. That's what I wanted to express with Alita. Welcome to the first part of my in-depth recap and review. Today I'll be showing you the first arc of Battle Angel Alita by Yukito Kishiro. In 1990, this series was released in Japan as Ganmu, which is the most proper pronunciation I could find and apparently a portmanteau of the English word gun and the Japanese word mu, meaning dream. The franchise itself is actually still ongoing, with the sequel manga, Last Order, starting up in 2000, and a second sequel, Mars Chronicle, picking up in 2014 right after that ended. This franchise has been running almost as long as Berserker. Between 1990 and 1995, the original series was first serialized in Shueisha's Business Jump magazine and published in 9 volumes. Genre-wise, it's a bit of an oddity. With its heavy action, graphic imagery, and grungy cyberpunk aesthetic, its target audience would generally be young men when it first released, but unlike most stories aimed at that demographic, the protagonist is female. That might be part of why it has a reputation of being a bit of a niche franchise compared to some others. The story was still successful in Japan, but it also gained a significant international fanbase for the time. It has the distinction of being translated and published in the West at a time when Japanese media was just starting to get more traction here. It was first published in English by Viz Media as a 25-page comic before being republished in the same volume format as the Japanese release. There are some oddities in that translation process that are characteristic of the time period. I will mention the most important changes before I jump into the story. In the early days of Japanese media translation in the US, it was common to make potentially drastic edits or changes in an attempt to cater to the English-speaking market, more so than today. In the case of Ganmu, the most obvious change is the title. The English translator evidently didn't think Ganmu, or Gun Dream, would be very marketable, and they also changed the main character's name. In the original Japanese, her name is Gali. For the English release, Gali became Alita, and Ganmu became Battle Angel Alita. I should say the Battle Angel name didn't come out of nowhere. That is the actual title of one of the early chapters, and the artist invokes a lot of angel imagery with this character. On the other hand, Gun Dream is a bit confusing in hindsight having read this series because there's a much bigger focus on martial arts than gunplay. According to an interview, that title came from an old storyboard, a sort of prototype story where Gali was a gun-wielding cyborg cop ultimately getting drawn into a dreamlike simulation, which is a concept that would briefly return much later in the series. In the interview, even Kishiro doesn't seem to think that title fits what the series ultimately became. The original English translations contained a lot of other name changes that I won't go into. Newer English releases of the original series using a new translation keep the name Alita and the title due to familiarity with existing fans, but revert a lot of the other name changes to the Japanese originals. That's the translation I first read and what I'll be reading for these videos. Let's jump into the story. By the way, technically I'm covering 2 arcs today. There is an introduction arc, but it's literally just the first chapter. The Makaku arc includes chapters 2 to 7. Anyway, we begin in a massive pile of garbage for our introduction chapter, Rusty Angel. And I don't really want to spend too much time on chapter art in this format, but I really do need to comment on this one since it did make a big impression on me when I first read the series. It's a very melancholic and vulnerable portrayal of our protagonist. Her delicate features and wings, contrasted with the broken machine parts of her body, it leaves a strong impression, and I think this aspect of her, in combination with her capacity to kill people with the flick of the wrist, is a big part of why the character is such a passionate fanbase. Spoilers. The contrast of strength and vulnerability is an intriguing one. At dawn, or possibly dusk for that matter, the twilight shows us an industrial cityscape in silhouette. Massive cranes shifting mountains of refuse, mechanical body parts piled high. A figure advances through the debris of shattered forms. It's a rather jaunty-looking man in a trench coat, picking through the junk for usable parts. He notices something amidst the pile and runs towards it, saying he can't believe it. He pulls a head and a torso out of the junk and laughs at his good fortune. Back in the shop, we learn that our man in the coat is Dr. Ito, a doctor and mechanic for cyborgs, and the head he found is actually alive. This is despite the fact that, based on her parts, he estimates that she's at least 2 to 3 centuries old. She has a human brain in that shell that's been in a state of hibernation, quote, due to a series of coincidences, unquote. She stirs and opens her eyes for the first time. Ito asks her name, but she can't remember. It's clear that she's lost her memory, so the doctor decides on a temporary fix. As of today, your name is Alita. He's sure that she'll remember everything eventually, and he's planning to help her and rebuild her body. His friend Gonzu remarks that Alita was the name of Ito's cat that died last month. In my past review, I made a joke about this, but in hindsight, I think it's an early foreshadowing of some toxic attitudes on Ito's part. There's an aspect of him initially seeing Alita as something more like a pet than a person with her own agency, despite his good intentions, which creates some tension we'll see later. Sometime later, Ito returns to the junk pile to search for parts to build a body for Alita with, this time carrying Alita herself on his back. He provides a bit of world-building information. For starters, this massive junk pile lies below a massive floating city called Zalem, a supposed utopia. Ito doesn't live there, though. He lives in the settlement around the junkyard, referred to as the scrapyard. Ito expresses a desire to get to know Alita, but she is disheartened or disturbed by her lack of memory. He basically tells her not to worry about it and gets frustrated at her being stuck in such a vulnerable state, vowing to build her a body. Next, we're dropped into the nightlife of the scrapyard. Despite the oppressive industrial hellscape, it seems some parts of town at least can turn into one big debauched party. Like a true cyberpunk setting, the endless pursuit of vice flourishes along with general moral decay. Away from the lights, one woman takes a cigarette break, showcasing her particularly elegant cyborg arms. Someone approaches her, and suddenly, whoosh, her head is obliterated with incredible force. Yeah, let this be a warning if you weren't aware already. This is a violent and sometimes outright gruesome series. This scene is intended to be your shocking introduction to that. Another day, Ito has outfitted Alita with those very same elegant arms, which he claims he got from a dismantler. I presume that means someone who sells off parts from the dead. Nonetheless, you might call the timing of this rather suspicious. More so when Ito notes that she still needs legs, and looks in on her that night saying, "I'll make you more and more beautiful with each extra part," before heading off into the night. Now Alita has legs! I think I can trust you to follow the implications here. Ito is sending up enough red flags to resurrect the Soviet Union. Just to reinforce that a bit, Ito's friend Gonzu warns Alita that there's a serial killer around targeting women. When she returns to Ito's clinic, Alita notices a wound on Ito's arm while he treats a patient. He brushes her off and makes an excuse about it, but Alita can tell he's hiding something. Now, Alita isn't a dummy. She can put two and two together. There is clearly something going on here, even though she doesn't want to assume the worst about Ito. So when Ito heads out that night, Alita gets up to follow him. She reflects that she doesn't actually want her memories back since she's happy with her life as Alita, living with Ito. Nonetheless, she can't ignore the signs around her and must discover the truth. Following Ito out into the night, Alita discovers him assembling a hammer out of his suitcase and hiding behind a pillar, laying in wait to ambush a feminine figure emerging from an archway. Alita won't stand for that. She throws herself down and grabs the hammer as Ito raises it, begging him not to do it. Alita reveals that she's figured out he was killing women to get parts for her body. Ito is shocked, but not all is as it appears. Ito looks around, finding that his would-be victim has disappeared. To Alita's shock, Ito calls her name and rears back, seemingly to strike at her. Instead, he uses the hammer to block a clawed attack. Yes, the attacker was some form of mutant. It seems that the helpless victim was not so helpless and not so much a victim. Ito reveals that this is the actual serial killer. Ito goes to fight her, but is quickly disarmed. Alita tackles her before she can hurt Ito, but the murderer swiftly leaps into the air out of her reach. Then something triggers in Alita, and a strange thing happens. Alita handsprings herself into the air, spinning higher and faster than the now very confused mutant. She delivers a dropkick so powerful it smashes the killer's head against the wall and the bloody mess sticks there. Alita herself is confused, not knowing she could do that or what that was. Ito, however, recognizes the move as Panzerkunst, a martial art originating on Mars, a curious puzzle piece to Alita's past. Moving on, a functionary at a place called Factory 31 pays Ito for taking care of the killer, speculating that the killer targeted pretty women out of jealousy. I will explain this guy's deal in a moment. Back at the clinic, Ito explains that the scrapyard doesn't have police. Instead, the factory puts bounties on criminals and sends so-called hunter-warriors to hunt them down for money. Alita, for her part, is embarrassed. She apologizes for getting the wrong idea and accusing him of being a serial killer. Ito just thanks her for saving him, though. Alita thinks about how she's grateful to him for giving her life, and we're shown that she's just ahead again. Apparently that body wasn't built to withstand the powerful moves she was pulling. And that's the introduction to Battle Angel Alita, which I think is pretty great. In terms of establishing setting and character, we learned a lot. For how few pages are in this one chapter, we got a decent sketch of the setting with Zalem and the scrapyard, as well as a lot of revealing character work with Alita. She's shown to be someone that is thankful and appreciative to people who care for her, but also perceptive enough to notice when something deceptive is going on. Not to mention, she's also self-aware enough to be embarrassed and apologize when she misinterprets the situation. She also has a strong sense of justice. She can't ignore such shady goings-on, and is willing to throw herself in harm's way even though she doesn't know how powerful she is. That violent power serves as a stark contrast to what otherwise feels like a pretty soft character at this point. Most fans I ask about what drew them into the series will often mention being charmed by Alita, specifically this combination of badass power, righteous values, and a certain degree of warmth and humility. All of that is here, and it's certainly what initially made me a fan of the character. Now, before I take you through the series' first major story arc, I want to explain a bit more about the setting. The story is generally good at getting across what the reader needs to know about the world, but most volumes have several information pages at the end laying out details about how this world works. I like this approach. I enjoy world building, so I'm always happy to get more details like this. This page explains what the factory is and that weird functionary from before. The factories are basically government offices or management centers for the various industrial complexes of the scrapyard, all serving the interests of Zalem, where virtually all food and goods produced in the scrapyard are sent. That is the closest thing to a government the scrapyard has. The factories are not managed by normal humans, but by specialized cyborgs called deckmen created by Zalem. Basically, the factory recruits people without much going for them in life to put their brains in these cylindrical cyborg bodies. They travel through the factory building via a linear tube system and get slotted into system functions to serve the factory. And that's just a glimpse of how the system around here treats humanity. Alright, let's move on to see what Alita does next. Sometime after their encounter with the serial killer, and long enough for Ito to build her a new body, Alita returns alone to the doorstep of Factory 33. She has decided that she can be a hunter-warrior too, just like Ito. Ito is very much not a fan of this, as we see in a flashback. In fact, he screams at Alita that he won't stand for her doing such an ugly thing as fighting. His dream is to make her a thing of beauty, so becoming a hunter-warrior is out of the question. This is revealing the more controlling and unsavory side of Ito's character. He's getting mad that Alita isn't following his desire for her, and not respecting her choices. It's not like he's even doing this out of fear for her safety or anything, he just doesn't want her doing something ugly. As I mentioned earlier, in some ways Ito treats Alita more like a pet, at least at this early stage. What I mean is not that he doesn't care about her well-being per se, but it's warped. He doesn't respect her autonomy as a person and thinks of her more in terms of his own desires. Alita herself says that she doesn't want to sit back and let Ito be the one taking risks for her. Privately, she also reflects that happiness that's just handed to you isn't worth that much. Ito practically demands she stay pristine and let him dirty his hands in blood. To which she rightly stands up and shouts, "I am not your dress-up doll," at him. It's a nice bit of assertiveness on her part, though slamming the door on her way out and shouting, "I hate you, Ito," comes across a bit petulant. Anyway, back at the factory, Alita is surprised by various deckmen doing their best Looney Tunes impressions, but eventually she gets what she wants: hunter-warrior registration. Apparently, the process of registering as a hunter-warrior requires no credentials or background checks to speak of. They just let anyone sign up for these things as long as they're willing to have an ID code lasered into their brain. Since all other parts of the body are replaceable in this world, this is the only type of biometric identifier that's really secure. Alita is initially worried about the laser damaging her brain, she can't afford to get any dumber, but goes along with it. Now with a barcode in her gray matter, the deckman asks Alita why she wants to become a hunter-warrior in the first place. This strikes a chord in Alita, as if she was asked something similar in some other place or some other time. Why do you fight? For what purpose? The answer she gave then was, "I'm doing it for my own sake." Now this is interesting, since earlier Alita expressed that she could be happy just living with Ito. But after that awakening of her violent capabilities, she seems to have developed a desire to engage with this dark world for herself, rather than allow Ito to shield her. Now let's introduce the antagonist of this arc. Somewhere in the scrapyard is a busy, dilapidated street where a man with a cybernetic eye is feeding his dog. Someone calls out for his attention. Two figures loom over him, one lanky cyborg and a massive cloaked figure. The lanky cyborg demands to know what price he'll take for the dog's brain. The man is, of course, horrified by this suggestion. "Are you crazy? Fangs like a son to me, not for sale." As the huge figure starts to salivate and growl, the lanky cyborg breaks out in a nervous sweat, grabbing the dog owner and saying he'll wish he'd just given up the dog. The massive figure roars and rips off the cloak, revealing a hulking cyborg to a confused crowd. He immediately snatches up a nearby bystander and cracks open the top of his skull, slurping out the brains like it's an energy drink. Now I will pause here to say that the portrayal of this character's violence has always struck me as straddling a weird line between gruesome and goofy. It makes it a little harder for me to take him seriously. On the other hand, if it went any harder on the gruesome side, that might be a bit too much for me, so this is likely for the best. The giant cannibal cyborg tosses the de-brained body into the crowd and snatches up his next snack. The now somewhat delirious, lanky cyborg explains that his companion isn't really hungry for brains, he's an endorphin addict. He consumes brains to get the endorphins in other people's brains. Well, that's one way to make your crazy brain-eating villain sound somewhat rational, I guess. Anyway, let's see what Ito's up to. Oh, he's throwing all the clothes he presumably had gotten for Alita into a waterway and swearing about it. Then he starts laughing like a madman. At this point, he's kind of looking like someone that took a breakup badly and has a screw loose. But surprisingly, he starts going on about how Alita was right, and he should never have tried to control her life. I mean, that's definitely an improved attitude, but it is a bit abrupt. This is character development without giving us a chance to actually see the development. In the grand scheme, I don't think this is a huge problem for the manga, but there are a few moments like this that feel a bit rushed along. Instead of getting any kind of thought process on what changed his viewpoint, we rush right into Ito contemplating why Alita chose to be a hunter-warrior of all things. Ultimately, he concludes that her fighter instincts must be driving her, or it might simply be fate. He also lets the reader know that Alita is wrong about something. He doesn't work as a hunter-warrior entirely for her sake. So he heads out on the job, running across the lanky cyborg from earlier. He's cornered some stray dogs and impaled one of them on a pipe before cutting off its head, grumbling about how much work it is to keep the big guy happy. It looks like he has a sack of severed animal heads at his waist. I think I might need to make sure there's a content warning on this video. For some reason, the animal mutilation bothers me a lot more than the human gore we've seen so far. His name is Izuchi, by the way, but that really doesn't matter, as on the very next page he encounters Ito, who decapitates him. With Izuchi's head impaled on his hammer, Ito reflects that he hunts for the pleasure of this moment. In his own words, he's a self-centered man that kills for pleasure. So, as it turns out, Ito has a creepy edgelord side. For having such a sinister motive for what he does, this side of Ito is, and I apologize for this spoiler, remarkably irrelevant to the rest of the story. I'm not completely sure why this side was given to Ito, but it always came across to me as edginess for its own sake. Anyway, Ito doesn't want Alita to know about this side of him and wonders how she will live her life as a hunter-warrior. Not too far away, the huge cyborg is slurping at the head of his latest victim when who walks before him but Alita, bold and unafraid. Well, she's a little nervous, but hides it well. Alita charges straight in, dodging a thrown body and mastering her fear as she goes. She launches herself up and delivers a flying kick that shears off the giant's arm. So far so good, but that wasn't enough to put this guy out of commission. The cyborg lashes out with his remaining arm while she's still in the air, and smashes right through Alita's body, shattering her. As you can see, Alita's first outing as a hunter-warrior is going really well. I think this whole sequence does a good job expressing how brutal a world this is, even to someone shown to be as badass as Alita is. We'll continue into some very nice colored panels at the start of our next chapter. Our villain is laughing like a maniac, and Alita is falling in pieces. Will that stop her, though? Of course not. With a battle cry, Alita catches herself with her one remaining hand, and then launches herself back into the air. To her enemy's shock, Alita stabs her arm deep into his eye socket in one of my favorite action moments of all time. This is how you use action to display character. The sheer, unflinching nerve and determination in the face of peril required to pull this off in her state is incredible. The monster rears back in agony, yet Alita digs in deeper, shouting in defiance. Ito stumbles across the scene and gapes in horrified astonishment. Ultimately, however, the cyborg manages to force her arm to break off and catch Alita in his remaining hand. After some weird grunting, he screams at Alita. "Girl, how dare you crush the eye of the great Makaku? Ah, the pain! I need more endorphins." Then Makaku, as he calls himself, starts prying at Alita's skull, trying to crack her open like an egg. Ito rushes in for the rescue, activating his much underutilized rocket hammer. His surprise attack obliterates a good chunk of Makaku's body, severing the arm holding Alita. The second blow destroys everything else, but to his confusion, Ito realizes that Makaku's head vanished at some point. Nonetheless, when he catches sight of the state Alita's in, Ito drops his hammer and rushes to her side, noting that her cranial shell is cracked. So she actually came very close to dying there. That's when Makaku strikes. His head is apparently independently detachable with some sort of worm body. He laughs like a lunatic and fires his head spike at Ito. The doctor is skewered through the stomach and collapses. Makaku slithers around and rambles about how nobody can defeat him. He stares at Alita and Ito to memorize them, then declaring that he will return one day to slurp the brain matter from their skulls. There's also a note saying that Makaku's intellect is tied to the body he's inhabiting, so the body he was using up to this point apparently forced him to act more like a dumb brute. He quotes Nietzsche about the mind being a plaything of the body, and throws himself off the ledge into the waterway. Ito remarks that he's heard of Makaku, a cyborg that's been on the wanted lists for years, but no hunter-warrior has been bold enough to go after him. Alita chose one heck of a monster for her first target. Seeing Alita is unconscious, Ito swears he won't let this be the end. He rips Makaku's spike out of his abdomen, which is not something you're supposed to do if you're stabbed, by the way. It just makes the bleeding worse. In a crowded area of the scrapyard, a crowd of people bustle about and watch some sort of gladiatorial death game on a nearby screen. Ito trudges through the rabble with Alita in his arms. He's obviously bleeding profusely, yet nobody takes notice. In fact, some passerby bumps him and knocks them to the ground. As he struggles, Ito promises to find Alita a body worthy of a warrior, with terrible strength and power, even if it takes her further from his own dreams for her. She must fight to survive in this world. At this point, Ito has managed to drag himself to a phone booth and call his friend Gonzu for help. As he slumps in the booth, Ito reflects that there's nothing in this world worth risking your life for, except for what you've built up on your own. And for him, that would be Alita. This is easily one of the best sequences in the manga at this point. Between Alita and Ito's near-death experience with Makaku and the uncaring indifference of the people of the scrapyard, it really drives home what an unforgiving world this is. There's some great atmosphere in these images, and it really nails a nice character arc for Ito coming to accept Alita's choices and that she has to be able to fight for herself to survive in this world. This video is already getting quite long though, so I'm going to share my reflections more at the end. We move to a dream that Alita is having, where she sees herself as a child, a crying, abandoned child that finds herself alone in the scrap. She's tossed out with the rest of the junk until someone lifts her out of the garbage and says that she's safe now. It's Ito. Back in the waking world, Ito and Gonzu confirm that her brain is undamaged. She's just dreaming. Ito is in pretty bad shape, though that impalement miraculously missed puncturing any organs. He's scarcely thinking about his own condition, however. Ito knows that Makaku is going to come after Alita, so he's determined to get her a body quickly. With Gonzu's help, Ito leads them down into his basement, where he keeps a collection of oddities he's found over the years. A few of them are references to old sci-fi movies. What he's come down here for, though, is this horrifying thing. a full set of cybernetic parts that look like some sort of half-finished animatronic nightmare. It comes together into a less disturbing shape when Ito connects it to power. Ito didn't want to give this body to Alita because it's a Berserker, something he found in a crashed spacecraft outside the scrapyard, a leftover from an old war. At first he was fascinated by the technology, but as he studied it he became horrified. Perfectly healthy people would be mutilated to put them into these Berserker bodies, technology intended solely to turn them into more efficient killing machines. The very nature of the thing was wrong, so Ito shut it away. Until now. Ito still isn't sure if giving this body to Alita is the right thing to do, but he is sure that she knows how to handle power. The most he can do is give it to her. Also, don't worry that the body looks male, they can program its variable musculature to adopt a more feminine shape. Unfortunately, Ito's not in any condition to operate, so Gonzu has to do the work despite only having experience as a cyborg vet. We'll be skipping the major surgery by way of Alita's dream sequence. She's essentially reliving a lot of the story so far. She sees herself accompanying Ito as a child, mirroring that earlier scene from the first chapter where Ito carried her while searching for parts. She was so happy to receive a name from him and be taken care of by him. But seeing him in danger woke something in her. Alita sheds her child body to fly forth in a battle-ready form. She feels like there's another self inside her, struggling to get out, and she has to push farther and faster to find answers. Suddenly, her body starts to disintegrate and she falls before the leering face of Makaku. Alita wakes up and is shocked to find herself with brand new arms and legs. She adapts quickly though, and is pretty happy with them, as Ito assures her this body is fit for a warrior. After they celebrate their success, Ito and Gonzu fall asleep out of exhaustion from the operation. Alita takes a moment to reflect on the situation, realizing that it must have been Makaku that hurt Ito so badly. She swears to crush his brains in her fist the next time she sees him. I actually really like that sequence. It clarifies what it is that Alita values. She's grateful to Ito for caring for her and naming her, and enjoys living with him, but she's also driven to action, both by a desire to protect and something within her she doesn't quite understand herself. Let's move away from Alita for a moment, though. Elsewhere in the scrapyard, two massive cyborgs are going toe-to-toe in a gladiatorial death match. One of them you might recognize from that broadcast earlier. People were watching this instead of helping a guy bleeding out in the street. The winner of this bout is Kanuba, who shreds his opponent with his grind cutters. These seem to basically be extendable chainsaw whips that launch out of his fingers. After the fight, Kanuba returns to his antechamber to rest. The champion instantly notices when someone tries to sneak in. The intruder professes to be a fan after that recent match, and Kanuba is a surprisingly good sport about someone sneaking past security to get there, offering him a drink. The intruder expresses admiration for Kanuba's grind cutters, which the champion boasts can reach a speed of Mach 3 or Mach 4. Of course, the intruder is revealed to be Makaku, having stolen the limbs of his henchman, the lanky cyborg from earlier, and propped up some poor guy's head on top to make his disguise. Declaring that Kanuba's body now belongs to him, Makaku attacks. Kanuba is quick to shred the whole room in front of him with a grind cutter, but Makaku slips away. He worms his way under the champion's cloak and up his back. Kanuba quickly loses control of his body. He tries to use the grind cutters to destroy himself before Makaku can take control, but when the smoke clears, Makaku has won and taken the champion's body for himself. Presumably, he beheaded Kanuba and stuck his own head in place on his body. Now that he has the ultimate body, his next step is revenge. Alita and Makaku are on a collision course for a final confrontation, both stronger than ever before. We move forward to a nighttime view of the scrapyard with Zalem looming above. The transportation tubes connecting Zalem to the ground creak, which is apparently a result of the moon's gravity subtly affecting Zalem's elevation. Ito and Alita look on. Alita doesn't like the sound, saying it resembles the screaming of a great mass of people. Ito remarks that she seems more mature, to which she says, "Oh, really?" with wide eyes. So she hasn't become all grim all of a sudden. Ito is worried about the Berserker body affecting her, but she assures him that no matter how much she seems to change, she'll always be the same Alita he knows. They come to this place to visit the Kansas Bar, a place hunter warriors gather. Alita is also just very casually carrying Ito and his entire wheelchair down the stairs with one hand. Ito is apparently a very familiar face here, as all the hunter warriors give him a warm welcome. They assume Alita is his new assistant and hit on her a bit. Ito says hello to the proprietor's baby daughter, named Koyomi, because I guess a bar filled with bounty hunters is as safe a place as anywhere in the scrapyard to take your daughter to work. The proprietor, by the way, is the same man who almost had Makaku eat his dog's brains in his introduction. The dog is here too. Ito calls everyone's attention and tells the whole room that Alita and him are going after Makaku and need the hunter warriors' help. The response is dead silence as everyone suddenly becomes very interested in their drinks. One hunter named Zapan speaks up, telling Ito that hunter warriors are lone wolves. Makaku is Alita and Ito's problem, not theirs. Others chime in, saying that the number of hunters killed while going after Makaku was in the double digits, and trying it was far more trouble than it was worth. Ito tries to shame them, but Zapan just tells him to shut up, saying that professionals need to evaluate risk when choosing their targets. The risk of going after Makaku is just too high. Alita kicks Zapan's drink into his face as she jumps onto a table. She calls the whole lot of them babies and miserable cowards. If her and Ito are the only ones with the guts to face Makaku, the rest of them might as well clear out of town. Now humiliated, Zapan is seething. Ito tries to bring the temperature down and have Alita apologize, but she isn't having it. Zapan rises, saying he doesn't take insults from anyone, especially a woman, saying that he'll remove her limbs and leave her in the street to teach her a lesson in hunter's courtesy. The rest of the bar is following his lead. Alita just says she'd like to see him try. Two of them kick out the table legs to knock her down, and those around her attack, but Alita rolls with it and flips over, knocking all their drinks into their own faces and lashing out with a spinning kick that manages to hit all three of them. Zapan pushes them to attack, but Alita effortlessly avoids everyone that comes after her. When she gets to Zapan, Alita gets under his guard, grabs his arm, and starts puppeting him around to slash at people. When she's done, Alita flips Zapan over her and drop-kicks him across the room to join a big ball of hunters that is then cartoonishly ejected from the premises. You know, this series is usually described as gritty sci-fi martial arts action, but we sometimes forget the slapstick. The creator has a sense of humor. So Ito sulks and promises to pay for all the broken tables and chairs. At least the baby is enjoying this. The two hunters left standing are shaking in fear, and one asks who the hell she is. And she says, "You can call me Miss Alita." Meanwhile, outside, the hunter warriors are about to encounter something much scarier than Alita. They grumble and complain about how she's hurt and humiliated them, only for several unlucky souls to be crushed with a massive foot. Zapan cowers as the giant plucks their heads from their bodies. Down in the bar, Alita and the dog, his name is Fang by the way, sense that something is off. The room starts to shake. A massive figure blasts right through the door frame, which, due to the max headroom sign, turns into a funny reminder that this guy is at least 4 meters tall if you couldn't tell. Of course, it's Makaku, using Kanuba's body. Nobody recognizes this at first, though, with Ito wondering what the champion of the Colosseum is doing here. The bartender is mostly concerned by the damage to his bar. One of the remaining hunters is apparently a big fan of Kanuba as he rushes forward asking for an autograph. Makaku says, "You bet," and proceeds to carve his name into the poor guy's back with a grind cutter and dice his skull. Then he laps up the guy's brain and eats it in one bite, slathering drool all over the place. "I've come for you, baby," he says while leering at Alita. Have I mentioned that Makaku is really gross? Yes, he's really gross. Ito states the obvious about Makaku taking Kanuba's power, but Alita remains stoic. Take a moment to appreciate these full-color panels of the Kansas bar tumbling into the wreckage of the bar entrance, and the standoff between Alita and Makaku. The monster notes that she has a new body, from which Alita concludes that he's using sensors to detect her body. This is pretty funny to me, because the last time Makaku saw Alita, she was missing all of her limbs and most of her torso. The fact that she can stand now at all should be enough to tell him she has a new body. The pixelated chapter art for this chapter actually is supposed to be Makaku scanning her, which is a bit neat. It looks awful in the grayscale version of this page, though. Anyway, Makaku elaborates on what he wants to do to Alita. Surprisingly, he doesn't want to kill her. No. He wants to tear off all her limbs and fashion her into a screaming pendant he shall wear on his chest at all times, so that he may listen to her lamentations every hour of the day. What does she think of that? Her response is bemusement. Whew, you're kind of messed up, aren't you? You really can't imagine happiness any other way? Makaku's response is oddly self-deprecating, referring to himself as a grubby little worm. He pauses and grins creepily when he sees the baby, before expounding a bit on his worldview. His life began with fear and pain. Eventually, he grasped that these feelings flowed like a waterfall, so the only way to escape their grasp was to inflict them on others. Thus, his lifelong goal was to acquire enough power to plunge others into terror and anguish. Thus, he unleashes his grind cutter, slicing through the air at Alita before stopping, right before skewering her head. Makaku cackles and demands that she beg for mercy from the King of Worms. Yeah, Alita didn't even flinch. In fact, she seems more annoyed that he'd expect her to be such a pushover as she kicks away his grind cutter. Makaku launches a series of grind cutter attacks, but even as he increases his speed, Alita is able to dodge them with apparent ease. She surmises that her best shot is to get in close past his defenses and finish this with one blow. Thus she waits for an attack and jumps into the grind cutter, running along it to close the distance. It's a clever idea. He can't defend himself with it already deployed, and with her on top of it. There's one problem. Makaku launches 2 more grind cutters from his other fingers, knocking Alita aside and into a wall. He mocks her, revealing that all 5 of his fingers on that hand are grind cutters, so he's still holding back and could have sliced her to pieces right there if he wanted to. Watching all of this, Ito is losing hope fast, but he also thinks the way Makaku is treating Alita is odd. Could it be that Makaku is in love with Alita? I don't really want to call Makaku's twisted obsession love, but Ito is onto something here. We'll get to that a bit later. In the meantime, Makaku takes the most cartoonishly villainous action possible and uses his grind cutters to kidnap an actual baby, Koyomi. He then makes some faces at her to make the baby cry, and makes as if to eat her. Alita calls out for him to stop, and he does, asking if the baby is hers, as if that's the only reason one might object to baby eating. Makaku decides to propose a game. Rather than slicing her to ribbons here, he slices open the floor, revealing a chasm below leading to the sewage runoff shaft. The game is Save the Hostage, Makaku reveals as he leaps down into the dark, daring Alita to come after him and rescue Koyomi. Being a certified good boy, Fang immediately leaps after him. Alita hesitates, sweating with an anxious look. The surviving hunters celebrate now that Makaku is left and they're still alive. Listening to their relief despite Koyomi's fate, Alita finds her resolve. Ito calls out to her as she steps to the edge, begging her not to walk into Makaku's trap. Alita responds that she can't back down now after talking such a big game earlier. It's her responsibility now. She can't leave the little baby to die after all, and promises the bartender to bring her back with a smile. Then Alita plunges into the depths. A short aside, I really like this character moment. Alita understands the danger and is very sensibly scared of following Makaku regardless of her earlier bravado. It's an obvious trap. Despite that, she knows that she can't just leave Koyomi to die and wants to live up to her own ideals. This is the difference between being fearless and overcoming fear to do the right thing. It's a very humanizing moment to break up the no-holds-barred superhuman cyborg combat. Moving on, Alita plunges into the darkness, and it seems like there's a lot more than a sewer down there. It seems like there are the ruins of a whole older city down there that the scrapyard is built upon. She doesn't get a whole lot of time to admire it since she's in for a rough landing, crashing into and bouncing off of a big corroded pipe. Apparently she's still feeling that hit from earlier. Nonetheless, she's able to acrobatically correct herself and maneuver using the falling rubble to stick her hand into the pipe, slowing her descent to a stop. She looks around, surveying the area for Makaku, only for the pipe to creak ominously and give out entirely, dropping her into what I will optimistically refer to as water. Back up in the bar, Ito and the bartender are kind of freaking out. Ito is frustrated that he can't help and basically starts throttling one of the surviving hunters when he suggests that he should just be glad he got out alive. The bartender wants to know if Alita even stands a chance of saving his daughter. Ito says that even Alita's Panzerkunst might not be enough, but her Berserker body may make the difference if she can activate its battle mode, or other hidden abilities he hadn't figured out yet. But the key to activating that mode resides in the basal ganglia, the instinctive reptile brain. Figuring out how to use that will be up to her. Alita pulls herself out of the muck and shakes out her big 80s hair like a dog. Because we occasionally just need to be reminded that she's cute, I guess. Our heroine goes on to explore the dilapidated melted landscape of the colossal sewers, being creeped out by what looks to be a mutant xenomorph facehugger swimming around, and ultimately stopping to catch her breath. Alita reflects that, for some reason, in the midst of danger in this dark hellhole, her body feels truly alive. That could be Alita's own affinity for battle, or her body's battle mode activating, or both for that matter. At any rate, her introspection is interrupted by the sound of a baby's cry. Alita rushes to find Koyomi hanging from a piece of rebar protruding from a wall. She's relieved, but can tell Makaku is nearby. She's proven right when grind cutters emerge from the water. Alita is able to dodge and deflect them, but Makaku claims he was going easy on her. He explains that this place is his hometown, where he grew up. The garbage of Zalem falls upon the scrapyard, and the runoff waste of the scrapyard runs down to these ruins. Thus he survived on the cast-off filth and corruption of those above him. Deeming that he has no further use for Koyomi, Makaku severs the column the baby was hanging from. Alita is able to catch her before she falls, though. This makes Makaku angry. His mother tried to get rid of him by flushing him down a toilet, which is how he ended up in the sewer to begin with. Okay. Yet here is Alita risking her life for someone else's baby. It's not fair. He points out that moving at the speed she has to dodge his grind cutters would injure or kill Koyomi, so Alita should be helpless. As he moves to strike her, however, a white blur emerges from a nearby pipe. It's Fang. Fang is a downright fearless superdog, latching onto Alita's old arm, which had been lodged in Makaku's eye socket all this time, and ripping it out. Alita gives him the good dog affirmation he deserves, and Makaku's eye socket gushes blood. While Makaku is distracted, Alita sends Fang off to take Koyomi to safety. When Makaku reaches after them, Alita strikes. The cannibal cyborg's arm explodes, energy crackling around Alita's hand. She dips her hand in some sort of tar, and we get our first look at Alita's iconic war paint, warning Makaku not to touch the baby or the dog because his only opponent is her. Her fist is wreathed in flame, burning away the sleeve of her coat. You might be wondering what the heck is going on. So is Makaku. His arm had 40mm thick armored plating, and she just sliced through it with her hand like it was butter. That's apparently the sort of plating you'd see on a naval warship. Alita is also a bit bewildered, though she doesn't let it show. She doesn't know why she drew those tar lines under her eyes either. She's operating on instinct now, just doing what feels natural to her body. Makaku's own stolen body does have some answers though. It seems the old Gladiator Champion's belt buckle thing is actually a combat analysis computer of some kind called Boarhead. It reveals that the Berserker body is apparently able to use compressed air and electricity to produce a jet of hot plasma over 15,000 degrees Celsius. Using a magnetic field, Alita is able to control the airflow of the plasma and use it to accelerate her fist using the same concepts as magnetic hydrodynamic propulsion, which the notes on the page mention was used in the film The Hunt for Red October. Basically, she's able to use the plasma to accelerate her strikes to an extreme degree. Makaku's armor has no chance of stopping it. Alita notes that all traces of fear are gone now, replaced by an urge to fight and defeat the beast before her. Makaku tries to strike her with his grind cutters, but losing an arm has put him off balance and he isn't able to absorb their recoil. His attacks miss, with Alita mocking him for not realizing the problem. She acrobatically maneuvers around his outstretched arm and into the air, despite his attempt to smash her against a wall, and lands atop his head. Game over, as Boarhead says. Despite everything, Alita seems inclined to be merciful, saying he should take this as a lesson to never do evil again or she'll sterilize his brain. Yes, she really is willing to let him off with a warning. Makaku laughs, saying, "That's my angel," but points out he didn't bring her down to the sewer just for the hell of it. He knows the waterways down here like the back of his hand. Just then, Alita notices something dripping from above them. Every day, at a specific time, a tank on the surface dumps its wastewater right on this spot. A column of water smashes down upon them like a freight train, washing both of them away. Don't worry though, Fang and Koyomi are safe. Makaku was really banking on taking this fight to that specific spot. Alita and her enemy are pushed over a ledge by the current. Makaku has her exactly where he wants. She can't make the plasma reaction while submerged in water and won't be able to fight the current to maneuver, making her a sitting duck for his grind cutters. She doesn't seem that concerned though. After tearing out and crushing Boarhead for daring to say game over earlier, Makaku contemplates how best to slowly pick her apart before attacking. Instead of his grind cutters launching, however, his arm explodes. Alita throws up a little victory sign. At the bottom of the east waterfall, Makaku is tossed up onto the bank and lands roughly. Alita calmly walks out of the water behind him and explains what just happened. Earlier, when she maneuvered around his arm, Alita made a cut in an actuator and weakened the surface structure. So when Makaku tried to fire off his grind cutter, his whole arm just gave out under the stress and exploded. Moving into the final chapter of this arc, Alita reiterates her intentions. Makaku has gotten away with killing people, eating their brains, and stealing their bodies for too long. She's going to bury him here. Makaku grinds his teeth in rage, calling Alita and everyone who stands against him hypocrites who have no right to judge. Everyone consumes the lives of others and dumps what's left into the sewers, and he refuses to believe that Alita is any different. After all, she's only after him for the bounty money, like everyone else. She refutes him. As he lashes out at her with a kick, which is about all he can do seeing as he doesn't have any arms left, Alita declares him to be wrong. She doesn't care about the bounty. She stops his kick cold, cutting into his leg with her plasma fingers and throwing him to the ground. Alita goes on to explain her circumstances, her amnesia and uncertain place in the world. She doesn't really know what it is to be alive, but she wants to find out, and that's why she fights, to find her true self in the midst of battle. That's why she became a hunter-warrior, not for the money or reward. As energy crackles from her fingertips, Alita says she also has faith that people can choose their own way of life, to be beautiful or ugly. metaphorically speaking. She strikes, cutting right through the center of his body. Makaku is forced to abandon it in his worm form as his stolen body explodes. He isn't quite done yet, though. Speaking from the smoke, Makaku says that Alita is pure as a knife, and perhaps with some regret that he cannot be like her. Alita is getting kind of annoyed at this point. She sticks out her tongue and says she's going to rip his tongue out because she's tired of listening to his phlegmy voice. Suddenly, Makaku bursts from the ground, wrapping his worm body around Alita. He warns her not to whip out her plasma just yet. They're standing atop an ancient fuel station, specifically a tank of metal hydride, an alloy that absorbs hydrogen. After that explosion, a lot of flammable hydrogen is now leaking. The whole place could go up with a single spark. Alita just rips her arm free with the power of magnetism, pointing out that she doesn't need plasma to beat him like this. When she turns to strike him, however, Alita realizes that the explosions already did a lot of damage. Fatal damage. Makaku is dying. Makaku says as much, but claims to be in bliss. After all, he gets to die in the arms of his lover. Let me just say, ew. Now they'll both be blown to kingdom come, he shouts. A spark from Makaku's damaged body serves as a source of ignition, and a massive explosion rips through the scrapyard. They must have moved a good distance away since the bar was apparently not caught up in the blast. Ito is instantly concerned about Alita, but it's good to see that Fang and Koyomi made it out of the sewers. In the midst of a storm of flames, two figures float in a safe bubble. It's Alita and Makaku, both still alive. The latter is confused, but Alita explains that she's using the magnetic power of her body to shield them from the flames, which are a form of plasma after all. Cool, very cool. I don't think that would shield them from all the heat and force of the explosion, but let's not overthink this. Alita did this so that she could speak to Makaku for a moment, asking him why he chose such a monstrous form for his cyborg body. He says that it was what he wanted. We're then taken through a look at Makaku's life, how he grew up in the sewer eating rats and drinking runoff. He was the lowest of the low, looking up at the streets of the scrapyard the way the people of the scrapyard might look up at Zalem. One day, two grade-A psychopaths decided it would be funny to fire a flamethrower in his face. He was badly hurt and his burn wounds got infected. His body essentially started festering and rotting away. He was alone. He was going to die alone with nobody to even notice, to become just another piece of garbage. Then, somebody found him. He awoke in a tank, being spoken to by the man who saved him. The man told him his body was too far gone to be saved, so instead he would build him a new body that embodies the desire in his heart. Alita takes notice that this man apparently had the same symbol on his forehead as Dr. Ito, though Makaku says he hasn't seen the man since. So anyway, that is the story of how Makaku gained his worm body, becoming the self-proclaimed king of worms. He stole others' bodies to live and devoured their brains to ease his pain. He destroyed just so that others would know he had lived. Nobody dared to stop him. In that way, though, he was still alone. Nobody answered his call. Nobody, that is, until Alita. Having this conflict with Alita, for Makaku, is the closest he's ever had to having someone care about him. Her undaunted focus on killing him and ending his reign of terror is the most intimate relationship he's ever had with someone, hence him referring to them as lovers earlier. Throughout this encounter, he has said that he didn't want to kill Alita. Capture and torture her, yes, but he wanted to keep her around. Ultimately, he's still that wounded boy in the sewers, terrified of dying alone. All of this is supremely twisted, of course, because of Makaku's view of people as inevitably selfish beings subsisting on the pain of others. Alita challenges this view, however. She has compassion even for people she's just met. She walks into danger for them and believes we have the power to choose how we want to be in this world. She is something that Makaku did not believe possible. Now, as the fire consumes him, Makaku is happy, saying that his true wish has been granted. This time, he was not alone. This time, there was someone to care, as he died. Alita emerges from the flames and looks back at the conflagration, tears in her eyes. She doesn't know if it's wrong or right, if they're of hatred or mourning. All she knows is that her tears flow for him. And thus ends the Makaku arc of Battle Angel Alita. Now this video is long, and I've tried to sprinkle my thoughts in throughout, so I'll try to be concise here. The introduction arc and the Makaku arc do a great job building out the bleak, grungy vibe of this world, and establishing Alita as a character whose compassion sets her apart in that world. It also establishes her as a complete badass, of course. There are rough spots in it. Ito has character development that really just abruptly happens without preamble, and that darker enjoys killing part of his character just seems edgy without actually contributing to the plot. Also, Makaku has this feature where his body determines his intellect, which is why he's a dumb brute when we first see him. It feels like setup for something, complete with a Nietzsche quote, but there's no payoff. It is never mentioned again, and the idea of one's body influencing their mind is basically dropped from this point on. It feels like the author was making some things up as he went along. I also would have preferred a more nuanced view of Makaku and his background maybe being brought forward a little bit. As it is now, it's easy to see Makaku as nothing other than a disgusting monster, and I don't think that last chapter background reveal is quite enough to change that. On the other hand, I'm not sure it's intended to. Nothing in his background absolves Makaku or justifies him, it just shows how this twisted and broken creature came to be. You aren't supposed to forgive him, but you can pity him. Ultimately, there's a contrast being drawn between Alita, who believes in living how she wants to live despite the world, and Makaku, who believes people in this world only live a certain way or are even doomed to live a certain way. As the author said in the quote I read at the beginning of this video, this is a story about finding a path of individuality in a world without values, without becoming cynical yourself. So that's what Alita is representing here. Hopefully I'll have the next arc's video up before too long, if it isn't up already, since I'm working on a couple of these together. Keep an eye out for it, and let me know what you thought of this video, or what you'd like to see me do in the future. That's all for now. Have a good day.